A billionaire marries an ugly employee out of revenge, but on their wedding night, he is shocked to discover that she is, Santiago Velázquez was always a man of control. From a young age, he learned that the world belonged to those who were willing to take it into their own hands. And that's exactly what he did. From a nameless boy on the streets of Madrid, he rose to the ownership of Velázquez Couture, one of the most influential brands in the fashion world. Nothing in his life was a fluke. Nothing was the result of luck. He shaped every detail of his career with surgical precision. And now, on the verge of sealing his absolute dominance with a marriage that would represent his final ascension, he believed he had reached the top. Camila Ortega was the perfect partner, beautiful, ambitious, and as power-hungry as he was. But what was supposed to be the final step toward perfection came crashing down in a cruel and unexpected way. The betrayal came to him like a poisonous whisper, at E. First he didn't believe it. It was impossible. Camila, as obsessed with success as he was, wouldn't risk everything on a whim. But Santiago wasn't the type to ignore rumors. He dug deep, and when he saw it with his own eyes, the impact was like a blade cutting through his flesh. Camila hadn't just betrayed him, she'd done it fearlessly, as if he were nothing more than an obstacle in her way. The humiliation burned more than the pain. For Santiago, it wasn't about love. He never believed in it. It was about power, about his image, his authority, his immaculate position. And he refused to be the man who was betrayed and ridiculed. That's when the idea came to me. At first, a flash of anger, a primal instinct to retaliate. But Santiago didn't do anything impulsively. He refined the idea, polished it into a perfect weapon. If Camila thought she could fire him, he would teach her a lesson. And what would be the biggest affront possible? Prove that he didn't need her or anyone like her. He would marry, but not another elite woman, not someone who would reinforce the narrative that he was still playing the same game. No. He would choose someone unexpected, someone no one would ever consider worthy of him. It was necessary to cause a shock, to break expectations. That's how he came to Isabella Rios. Isabella was just a shadow in his empire, a cleaning lady, invisible to everyone, including him, until now. Santiago saw her for the first time when his plan was already formulated, small, discreet, without any trace of the world he dominated. It was perfect. The contrast would be devastating. The media would explode. Camila would drown in her own arrogance, and he, Santiago Velázquez, would emerge stronger than ever. For him, it was a masterstroke. What he didn't anticipate was that by dragging Isabella into his game, he would be opening the door to something that was never within his calculations. The unpredictable. The proposal was a surprise. Isabella didn't understand. She couldn't process what was happening when she was called to the office at the top of the building. She had never been there before. She had never even imagined stepping on that floor. Everything in that room seemed too opulent for someone like her. The designer furniture, the refined aroma that hung in the air, the view that stretched out as if Santiago Velázquez owned the world. And in a way, he did. But what awaited her in that office was something she would never have considered in her wildest dreams. Santiago Velázquez, the man whose name appeared on the covers of magazines and newspapers, had offered her marriage. Not with flowers, not with promises of love, but with a tone of absolute coldness. "It will be advantageous for both of us," he had said, as if he were closing some kind of deal. And Isabella knew, in that moment, that her life would never be the same. She tried to refuse, of course. She tried to argue that it was crazy, that she was not part of that world, that none of it made sense. But Santiago Velázquez would not take no for an answer. He offered her money, an amount she would never have in her entire life. He offered security, a new identity, a new status, a life she could never achieve on her own. But none of that convinced her. What kept her there in that room was something else. It was the way he looked at her, not as a man in love, not even as an interested man, but as someone who desperately needed to make it work. as someone who behind all. The ice was fighting not to lose something, and against all her instincts, Isabella gave in, not for the money, not for status, but because, for some inexplicable reason, she wanted to know what was hidden behind that man who seemed unbreakable. The wedding was held quickly, with no time for doubts or regrets. No fairy tales, no grand ceremonies, just a calculated, cold event, made to serve Santiago's purpose. Isabella's name exploded in the media overnight, and she was thrown into a world that did not belong to her. The flashes, the interrogations, the unsolicited interviews. Everyone wanted to know who the mysterious woman was who had captured one of the most powerful men in the world. But the truth was that Isabella had achieved nothing. She was a piece, a symbol, something that Santiago used to send his message to the world. And while the press dissected every detail of the unexpected union, she realized that she was entering into a game she never wanted to play. Camila, for her part, did not react with the expected surprise. On the contrary, her smile upon seeing the news was pure amusement. Did Santiago think he was in control? What could he play with her? Camila knew this game better than anyone. If he thought he had won by exchanging her for someone like Isabella, he didn't understand anything about power. And although Santiago thought his revenge was sealed, he didn't realize that he had made a crucial mistake, underestimating Camila Ortega. In the first few days, after her wedding, Isabella realized that she wasn't just living a lie. She was being molded to fit a role that wasn't hers. Santiago wanted her to behave a certain way, wear a certain outfit, speak in a certain tone. Everything was rehearsed, calculated. He left no room for error. He accepted no mistakes. For him, this union was a transaction, and like any business, it had to be carried out perfectly. But Isabella was never a woman to be easily defeated. And as much as she was at the center of one of the biggest media scandals, as much as her name was repeated in all the sensational headlines, she wouldn't allow herself to be erased. She knew deep down that she was just a piece in this game, but she wouldn't be a silent piece. The first time she challenged Santiago happened without planning. It was a night of events, one of those luxurious dinners where the elite gathered to demonstrate power through expensive clothes and empty conversations. He had given her clear instructions. She was to smile only when necessary, speak only when asked, act as an extension of him, not as an independent woman. But when a socialite commented disdainfully on her humble origins, expecting Isabella to cower, she did exactly the opposite. Yes, I cleaned the halls of Velázquez Couture. That's how I learned to recognize the dirt that people like you try to hide under the luxury carpets. The silence was instantaneous, and Santiago, for the first time, was speechless. It was not what he expected. It was not what he had planned. And in that instant he realized that Isabella was not a simple accessory. She was a force that he did not know how to control. After that, something changed between them. It was not a rapprochement. It was not complicity. It was a constant confrontation. Santiago tried to impose his vision of the world, and Isabella refused to accept it. He expected obedience. She responded with resistance. And in the midst of that standoff, one thing became increasingly clear. Santiago didn't know what to do with someone who didn't fear him. Isabella didn't want his money. She didn't want his name. She didn't want to be part of the show he'd put on. And as much as he tried to ignore it, Santiago felt a growing irritation, not because she wasn't conforming to what he wanted, but because, in some ways, she was dismantling the wall he'd built around himself. Meanwhile, Camila was playing her cards behind the scenes. Santiago believed he was the one in charge, but she knew the weaknesses he refused to admit he had. If there was one thing Santiago Velázquez hated more than being betrayed, it was being found out. And Camila knew exactly how to do it. Her plan wasn't just to destroy his marriage, it was to dismantle the image of absolute control he so zealously cultivated. While Santiago and Isabella waged a silent war at home, Camila was about to take the battle to the world. And when the first blow came, Santiago realized that he had perhaps underestimated his greatest adversary. Camilla's blow came in the form of a carefully crafted dossier leaked to the media at just the right moment. In it were minute details about Santiago and Isabella's marriage, or rather, the farce it represented. The contracts, the amounts involved, the confidentiality clause Isabella was forced to sign. All of this was laid out in plain letters on gossip sites and in business papers. The news spread like wildfire. From one day to the next, Santiago Velázquez, the untouchable, the ruthless strategist, became the target of speculation. Had he married out of revenge? Had he bought a wife? And worse still, had he completely lost control? The reaction was instantaneous. Velázquez Couture's management demanded answers. Investors called non-stop, questioning the stability of the company. The brands associated with her label began to consider the impact of this scandal on their public image. But none of this bothered Santiago as much as the way Isabella was involved in the narrative. Before, she was already seen by many as an opportunist, but now they called her bought, an accomplice to a big lie. Isabella never wanted to be the center of attention. She never wanted to be the protagonist of this story. But suddenly, her life was all over the headlines. She had become the face of a marriage that no one took seriously. And for the first time, Santiago realized that his perfect plan was not only falling apart, but it was dragging someone innocent with it. The storm. Inside Santiago's house was as intense as the one outside. Isabella demanded answers, not because she didn't know the marriage was an arrangement, but because she was never informed of the full implications of that game. You used me to hurt someone else, but now I'm the one being crushed in the process, she said, her voice firm and unwavering. Santiago, accustomed to being in control of any situation, found himself faced with something he didn't know how to deal with, the genuine disappointment of someone who wanted nothing more from him than the truth. And the worst part? He had no prepared response. For the first time in years, he had no contingency plan. Camilla, for her part, was savoring every moment. But she knew this was just the first step. What she wanted was not just to destroy Santiago in the media. She wanted to see him destroyed. She wanted to see him break down in front of everyone who had always admired him. And for that, she had more cards to play. Santiago had no idea, but the worst part of the storm was yet to come. The silence between Santiago and Isabella became unbearable. He was not a man who apologized, and she was not a woman who accepted being manipulated without consequences. For days, they barely exchanged words inside the mansion they shared. The house, once a symbol of power for Santiago, now seemed like a battlefield where no one wanted to give in. Isabella did not try to flee, not because she did not want to, but because she knew that leaving now would mean giving Camilla exactly what she wanted, a complete triumph. But staying meant facing Santiago, a man who was beginning to show cracks that not even he seemed to notice. For the first time, the ruthless fashion mogul seemed lost. It was during a tense dinner in front of an untouched plate that Isabella finally broke the silence. "You didn't expect me to go this far, did you?" The question hung in the air. Santiago, who always had an answer for everything, took a while to answer. He didn't need to lie to her. She already knew. Yes, she had underestimated Camilla. Yes, he had thought he could simply erase a betrayal with a grand gesture without consequences. But what he didn't foresee was that, in the midst of that chaos, he himself would change. That Isabella would change something inside him. And the truth was even worse. He didn't know how to deal with it. Santiago's vulnerability was something few had witnessed, and Isabella, without realizing it, began to see beyond the mask he wore to the world. But that didn't mean she would forgive him. "You put me here as a piece, but I'm not a game," she said. And Santiago felt the force of those words like a blow. His pride wanted to fight back. He wanted to remind him that it was all a deal. But something inside him wavered. For the first time, he wondered if he wanted her to see him simply as a cruel and calculating man. and that doubt was the first sign that the control he so cherished was slipping from his hands. Meanwhile, Camilla prepared the next act of her revenge. If destroying Santiago's credibility in the media was the first blow, now she wanted to hit him where it really hurt: his company. Using strategic contacts, she began to spread rumors among investors, questioning Santiago's ability to lead Velázquez Couture after such a huge scandal. In the eyes of the market, he no longer appeared as an unwavering visionary, but as an impulsive and emotionally compromised man. And if there was one thing investors hated, it was instability. When Santiago realized that the company he built with his own hands was corroding from within, he knew he had to act. But the question was there still anything left to save? Santiago has always been driven by the survival instinct. He did not build an empire by allowing himself weaknesses or vacillations. But this time the threat was different. Camilla was not just trying to hurt him. She wanted to destroy him completely. She wanted him to see her. Destruction in real time. And the worst, she was succeeding. Investors were walking away, shareholders were questioning his leadership, and for the first time there were rumblings that Velázquez Couture needed new direction. All of this infuriated him. But what bothered him most was something else. It was Isabella's gaze, not out of pity but out of something worse. From someone who predicted that outcome all along. From someone who, deep down, already knew she was digging her own downfall. Higuic needed to react, and fast. But before he could strategize, the media poured more gasoline on the fire. An exclusive interview with Camilla aired, where she masterfully painted herself as the betrayed and humiliated woman, while implying that Santiago had been emotionally unstable since the breakup. She didn't need to accuse him of anything directly. She simply suggested that Isabella's choice of wife was a desperate, vengeful reaction, an impulsive act by someone who couldn't handle rejection. The story spread like a plague. The brilliant tycoon was now seen as a man driven by a wounded ego, and for someone who has always controlled her own image with an iron fist, this was the biggest affront possible. Isabella watched everything from afar, knowing that this war was not hers. But at the same time, she couldn't ignore that with each new blow from Camilla, Santiago grew tenser, quieter, more somber. He still struggled to maintain his pose, still pretended that he could reverse everything, just as coldly as before. But Isabella could already see what he refused to admit. This time, he was not in control. When word reached him that the shareholders were pushing for an emergency meeting to be called, Santiago realized that he no longer had any other choice. He needed to confront Camilla directly. The night of the meeting came faster than he would have liked. The partners of Velázquez Couture were gathered in one of the private rooms of a luxurious hotel, ready to discuss the future of the company. Santiago entered the room with his usual impeccable posture, but Isabella, watching from afar, noticed something different about him. For the first time, it seemed like he didn't have all the answers ready. Camilla, sitting among the influential investors, looked at him with a victorious smile. Her game had been well played, and she knew she was in control at the moment. But Santiago Velázquez was not a man to accept being brought down so easily. He still had one last card to play. Santiago listened patiently as the shareholders voiced their concerns. Words like instability, compromised image, and need for restructuring were thrown on the table with a coldness that disgusted him. He knew there was no loyalty there, only money and power. But it was when Camilla leaned forward slightly, her smile calculated, that he felt the real blow. Maybe it's time to consider new leadership, someone who can better represent the values of Velázquez Couture. She said this without having to mention his name directly, but the message was clear. Camilla didn't just want to bring him down, she wanted to take his place. Santiago's blood was boiling, but he didn't show it. Instead, he adjusted his suit, took a deep breath, and prepared to turn things around. Interesting, he said, his voice cracking. Because if we're talking about image and values, maybe we should remember who that brand really represents. He slid a tablet across the table, displaying the company's latest numbers. Even amid the scandal, Velázquez Couture still dominated the market. And more than that, the fallout from the wedding had generated an absurd level of engagement. Searches for the brand were on the rise, the latest collections were breaking sales records, and the public was more curious than ever. Do you want to remove the man who made this company what it is today from power? Because if that's the case, I'll happily watch from the sidelines as they try to sustain this structure. Without me. There was a tense silence in the room. Camilla hadn't expected that. She played to the audience's excitement, but she forgot the most important factor, the numbers. And Santiago knew that, in the end, that was what really mattered to these men in expensive suits. The shareholders began to exchange glances, assessing the situation with brutal pragmatism. Santiago had turned the situation around for now, but he knew that didn't mean Camilla had given up. She just needed a new strategy. And that kept him on his toes. When the meeting was over, he walked out of the room, feeling a huge weight on his back. But before he could lose himself in his thoughts, a familiar voice brought him back. Isabella was there, staring at him with her arms crossed. "You won today," she said bluntly. "But for how long?" Santiago had a hard time admitting it, but she was right. The game wasn't over yet. Camilla was a dangerous opponent, and as long as she was lurking, he could never let his guard down. But what really bothered him was something else. He realized that in the last few days, Isabella had become more than just a piece in that game. And that changed everything. Santiago wasn't a man who liked to question his own decisions, but that night, as he looked at his reflection in his office mirror, he realized that he had lost something along the way. Victory in the meeting brought him no satisfaction. He was tired, but not physically. It was a deeper tiredness, something he had never felt before. For the first time, he wondered if all this power play was really worth it. He achieved everything he wanted, dominated the fashion market, built an impenetrable reputation. But now what? What was left but endless wars for control? The sound of footsteps in the hallway brought him out of his thoughts. He knew who she was even before he turned around. Isabella walked into the office without hesitation, her eyes holding a weight he had already learned to recognize. She wasn't there for another argument, not even to provoke him. "You have to decide what you really want, Santiago," she said in a firm but not aggressive voice. "Because from what I see, all you do lately is fight ghosts that only exist inside your head." Her words hit him hard. No one ever had the courage to talk to him like that. No one dared to ask him so directly. But Isabella was never afraid of him. She turned to leave, but he stopped her before she reached the door. "And what do you think I should do?" The question slipped out before he could stop himself. It was a request for guidance, something he would never ask anyone. But Isabella didn't smile, showed no satisfaction at seeing him in that state. She just sighed. "I can't answer for you. Only you can decide if you'll continue to fight to maintain an illusion, or if you'll finally face the truth." Santiago stood there, watching her go, and realized that for the first time, someone was challenging him not out of ambition or power, but because she truly cared. Meanwhile, Camilla was preparing for her next move. If Santiago thought he'd escaped the trap, he was wrong. She still held a trump card, something that could destroy him once and for all, something he could never have predicted. The war wasn't over yet, and this time she would play dirty. Camilla's final blow came in a way Santiago could never have imagined. At a surprise press conference hosted by one of his competing brands, he presented an even more explosive dossier. But to him it wasn't just about the marriage they'd forged. It was about him, about his humble origins, about the deals he'd closed in the past, about every mistake he'd tried to hide to build his impeccable image. Santiago Velázquez, the untouchable tycoon, now stood naked before the world, and Camilla knew exactly where to hit to hurt him. The headlines were quick to spread. Santiago Velázquez's dark past. The empire built on lies. The truth behind Velázquez haute couture. He had spent his entire life building a name that inspired respect and admiration, and now it was all at risk. But what affected him most weren't the attacks on his reputation. It was the realization that all his life he had believed that power would protect him. And in that moment he saw what was really left when it all came crashing down. When he returned home that night, Isabella already knew what had happened. She saw him walk in, his shoulders tense and his eyes dark. But he didn't say anything. She knew it wasn't the time. Santiago didn't apologize. He didn't try to justify himself. He just threw himself on the couch, exhausted, with his head in his hands. The silence between them was long, but not awkward. And then, unexpectedly, he laughed. A low, almost ironic laugh. "She hit me, didn't she?" he asked without waiting for an answer. But Isabella, who always saw beyond the masks, just shook her head. "No, Santiago, you defeated yourself." The phrase hung in the air for a few seconds, but he understood what she meant. He wasn't in that situation just for Camilla. He dug his own ruin by turning everything into a matter of ego, building a life where no one could really get close. And in that moment, he realized that his war was never against Camilla. It was against himself. And he was finally ready to stop fighting. In the days that followed, Santiago did something he never imagined doing. He stopped. For the first time in his life, he didn't try to control everything. He didn't try to desperately remake his image. He simply watched. He observed the damage, the consequences, and above all, himself. His name was in all the newspapers. His reputation was tarnished. And the empire he had built with so much effort was more vulnerable than ever. But strangely, he didn't feel the fury that always accompanied him in those moments. There was something different now. An exhaustion that wasn't just physical, but mental. As if after struggling for so long, he had finally realized that he didn't even know what he was fighting for anymore. Isabella stayed by his side, but not in the way one would expect. She didn't offer empty words of comfort. She didn't try to say everything would be okay. Instead, she treated him exactly the same as before, with the same firmness, the same sincerity. That was what made Santiago realize what really mattered. While the outside world attacked him, Isabella didn't turn away. Not because she needed to, but because she chose to stay. And for the first time, he wondered, when had she stopped being just a piece in the game to become the only genuine thing left in his life? The answer came in a simple moment, without any grand revelations or dramatic gestures. It was late at night when he walked into the kitchen and found her there, sitting at the counter, drinking tea, as if there wasn't a hurricane outside. He stood in the doorway, simply watching. Then, without thinking, without planning, he asked, "If I could go back in time, do you think I would have done it differently?" Isabella looked at him and thought for a moment before answering. If it was the Santiago from before, no. But the Santiago from now, maybe. It was there that he realized. He had changed. Not because he wanted to, not because he had planned it, but because Isabella made him see everything he refused to see. The truth about himself, about his empire, about what really mattered. And for the first time, he knew he couldn't go on with his life the way he had before. Not after all this. He needed to make a decision, and this time it wouldn't be based on revenge, pride, or control. It would be based on the one thing he had always avoided: the truth. The next morning, Santiago made a decision that surprised everyone. Instead of counterattacking Camilla, instead of trying to clean up his image with another strategic move, he called a press conference. But this time, not to manipulate the narrative, but to tell the truth. Under the spotlight, he did not try to hide his humble origins, nor mask the mistakes he made throughout his career. For once, he was not the untouchable tycoon, the man who calculated every word. He spoke like a real man, like a man who recognized that he had lost his own game. The confession generated immediate reactions. Some called him weak, others saw it as a smart move to regain the market's trust. But in the end, it wasn't about the others. It was about him. Santiago felt a weight lifted off his shoulders, not because his reputation was saved, but because, for the first time, he didn't have to keep up a charade. He ended the press conference without promising redemption, without justifying himself too much, just making it clear that from that moment on, he would do things differently. And at that moment, she realized that this was the first real step toward change. Camilla watched the press conference from afar, with a cynical smile. Because of her, Santiago had given up. But deep down, there was something that bothered her. He didn't look like a defeated man. He looked like a free man, and that irritated her more than any poorly executed revenge, because she was still trapped in the same game, while he had finally escaped. And if there was one thing Camilla hated, it was losing control. When Santiago returned home that night, he found Isabella in the garden, looking up at the sky. He walked over, and for the first time, he didn't have to pretend to be someone else. "I think I did what I had to do," he said, and Isabella smiled, never taking her eyes off the stars. Finally. He didn't need to say anything else, because at that moment he knew. Everything had changed, not just for him, but for both of them. In the days that followed, Santiago began to restructure his life, not just professionally, but personally. He made decisions that would have been unthinkable for him before. He reduced his participation in some meetings, delegated functions that he had always insisted on controlling alone, and most importantly, he began to reform Velázquez Couture from within. For the first time, he saw that his company was not just an extension of his ego. If it wanted to remain strong, it needed to allow other voices to be heard. And surprisingly, it didn't make him feel weak. On the contrary, he began to understand that true power was not in controlling everything, but in knowing when to let go. Isabella, for her part, didn't expect her life to change as much as Santiago's. When she entered into this arranged marriage, she thought she would simply have to survive in a world that didn't belong to her. But in the end, she was the one who helped transform this world. Santiago was no longer the man who used her to hurt Camilla. He became someone she respected and, more than that, someone she began to truly care about. Yet something inside her made her wonder, what now? Would the agreement between them end there? Or was there something else that neither of them wanted to admit? Santiago asked himself this question too. But unlike what he would have done in the past, he decided not to force an immediate answer. For the first time, he didn't want everything to be a power play, a meticulously calculated plan. He wanted to discover the answers without rushing, without masks. And that scared him as much as it intrigued him, because for the first time he truly cared about someone without there being a contract, a clause, or a hidden agenda behind it. Just him and Isabella, no need. To win. That night, as the two of them walked together around the property, Isabella suddenly stopped and looked at Santiago. "And now?" she asked bluntly. He took a deep breath and looked at her as if he were really seeing someone other than himself for the first time. "Now," he replied with a slight smile, "we've figured it out." In the days that followed, Santiago and Isabella began to rediscover their own lives, now free from the weight of lies and the need to prove something to the world. The media was still watching them, trying to predict the unlikely couple's next move. But for once, Santiago didn't care. He no longer needed to control the narrative, because there was finally something in his life that didn't depend on strategy. The genuine connection he was building with Isabella. Camilla, for her part, realized that despite having caused harm, she hadn't achieved what she truly wanted. Santiago wasn't destroyed. He had found a new way to reinvent himself, one she never anticipated. And it ate at her, because in the end, he had escaped the game she was still playing. But instead of continuing to push, Camilla decided to walk away, at least for now. She knew that at some point she would have another chance to challenge him. But for now, it was time to retreat. Isabella, in turn, realized that she no longer lived in anyone's shadow. Before, she was just the woman Santiago used for a revenge plot. Now she was someone who walked by his side by choice, not obligation, and that made all the difference. She still didn't know what the future held for both of them, but for the first time, she wasn't afraid. Santiago looked at her that night, sitting on the porch, and realized something he never imagined. He no longer needed to win. He no longer needed to prove anything. For the first time, he could simply exist. And in that moment, he knew that his greatest victory wasn't defeating Camilla or saving his company. His greatest victory was learning that sometimes giving up control was the only way to get something truly worthwhile. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss our most impactful stories. Give it a like if you believe in justice and second chances. Share your thoughts. Do you think revenge can ever be justified? We'd love to hear your story. Share this video with someone who needs a life lesson.